Lilly, Rattner, Shirey. I don't have a middle name. Instead, I prefer to use my maiden name as my middle name because I'm very proud of it. October 27th, 1932. Well, I always say that there were just the five of us. Just the five of us, including my grandmother who was hearing. And her eyesight wasn't so great and her hearing was going down. You can see in the photo she was a little bit older at the time we're speaking of. She was really a role model to me. Then there was my mother, who was deaf, and of course she was the daughter of my grandmother. Then my Uncle Richard, and he was the sibling of my mother. Now, he wasn't married in the time of which I'm speaking, but later on he did marry. And he became, in a sense, I guess you could call him our guardian. He took care of us, he watched over us. We were so blessed to have him in our lives. I so appreciate him because I grew up with no father. My parents had separated when I was young, so I always looked up to my Uncle Richard. I was incredibly close to him. Then there was my sister, who was deaf, and then there was myself. Well, you can look in the picture and see that her family constellation was comprised of 5 children, of which she was the third. So that was the Wiener family, and she was the third child born into that, and she was deaf. The fourth child was also deaf. And there's a strange story that accompanies this explanation. This is what my grandmother said, and my mother concurred. Now, when my grandparents were married, I guess I should back up. Now, I never met my grandfather. He died before I was born. But my mother was very close to her father. And later I understood why and the reasons behind why they were so close. My grandparents married, and it was a second marriage for my grandfather. His first wife had died, giving birth to a child. And this child was actually a son, which was my mother's stepbrother. And I actually did get a chance to meet him later. We lost contact, but evidently my grandmother treated him just like all the other kids and was very good to him. So then my grandparents had 5 children together, the first of whom was an uncle who was hearing, and then a second uncle was born who was also hearing. The third was my mother, whom they found to be deaf, and my grandmother had no idea how to cope with this. She was totally overwhelmed and didn't know what to do. Now remember, we're talking about a long time ago, and my grandmother was from Switzerland. Now, that country in that time, deafness was looked down upon, the deaf people were very isolated, and the country folks made fun of them and didn't treat them very well. This was back then, and I'm hoping that it doesn't happen today as well. But my grandmother didn't know what to do. She was paralyzed with fear at the fact that she had a deaf child. And it seems that she didn't really accept my mother very well, but my grandfather did, and he seemed to cope very well. Later, my mother found out why this was so. It seems that my grandfather had a deaf cousin somewhere in the vicinity, and so he had a familiarity with deafness, but my grandmother didn't. So my grandmother somewhat shunned my mother, and as my mother grew up, they didn't have a very nurturing, fostering relationship. As I was growing up, when I look back, I could see that in their dynamic a little bit. Anyway, a fourth child was born who was also deaf. And my grandmother seemed to calm down a little bit at the birth of this fourth child. And of course, my mother was overjoyed because she'd finally have somebody to communicate with. And they were very close, these 2 deaf siblings. And my grandmother decided she wanted to have more children. This is what she always said, but she was concerned. She wanted to have more children, but she certainly didn't want to have any more deaf children. So she went to a doctor, and he suggested that my grandparents wait 8 or 9 years until they tried to become pregnant again. Kind of a strange story, but that's what my grandmother told me. So they did indeed wait, and they waited about 8 years, and then a 5th child was born, who was an aunt of mine who was born hearing. Well, my childhood seemed to be going along quite well. I had a very good time growing up. I went to a school for the deaf. Where was that? In Austria, of course, in Vienna. And I don't know if I'm right or not, but it seems to me that there were somewhere 12, 13, 14 different schools for the deaf in Vienna. There was a Jewish school, there was a state school for the deaf, there was a day school. just a whole laundry list of different schools for the deaf. I don't even know what they were all called. But my mother decided to take me to a day school for deaf children, and I commuted back and forth every day to that. I went in kindergarten, and I stayed until 1938. My sister was in first grade. She was ahead of me by a year. And I remember that pretty well. I don't remember specifics about the school or anything. I just know that I went. I remember going to school every day. I remember being timid. My sister always teased me and said, "Oh, you always cried every day when you get into school." But I was little, I was scared. Anyway, all that came to a halt because, of course, what happened. I explained that previously, that when the Nazi occupation happened and when Germany invaded Austria, everything changed overnight, drastically. There were all these rules, regulations, edicts, I don't even know what they were called, but Jewish children no longer had permission to attend schools. So my education came to a halt in 1938, and until 1940, I didn't go to any school. So people often ask me, "What did you do? You just stayed home?" I remember just staying home. That's it. My mother protected us and didn't even let us out of the house. We had to stay home all the time. And of course, my mother could leave to go shopping, but we were homebound for 2 years. But I think it was okay. And when I look back, maybe I just had a limited imagination or something, but it didn't seem to bother me. The home environment was so rich. I remember my mother telling a lot of stories and entertaining us all the time. Well, previous to all of this happening, my mother had worked as a seamstress, and my uncle was quite an accomplished tailor. And so what they decided to do was start sort of a cottage industry, a home business during the wartime. And my mother helped out with all the sewing and all the details of what my uncle's business would be. And this is a business they ran out of our home. And we all lived together. So that's what happened. My mother helped my uncle out with his business. Well, I don't remember much of what went on at that time. I remember asking my mother, "Why can't I do this? And what's going on?" And I remember her saying, "Well, we're not permitted to. We're not allowed to." It was just very simply explained to me. Oh, no. Never. Never. That started after the 40s, I believe, from the 40s on. But my mother was the one person who was able to go out and do shopping or whatever she needed to do. At that time, there was only a 2-hour window of opportunity every day to go shopping, and my mother would be stuck in these long queues. She'd come back and explain about how scared she'd been standing in the queues, and my mother didn't really look Jewish. You can tell from the pictures that her facial features didn't look Jewish, really, and she had blonde hair. My grandmother did, however, but my mother didn't. So she would be in these queues, very trepidatious, worrying that somebody was going to realize that she was Jewish and mistreat her. And she would always tell us when she came home, "I needed to get food for my children. I needed to think about getting milk for my children." Of course, we'd say, "Thank you, Mama. Thank you, Mama." She was always telling us about how scared she was. She did see Hitler at one point, too, in one of the parade formations that was happening with the army and what have you. And she saw people saluting and doing the Heil, Sieg Heil Hitler sign and whatever. She did see Hitler. And that was interesting. Did she salute too? Oh, no, no, no. She was in the back of the crowd. She refused. She wouldn't have anything to do with that. But my mother said that seeing Hitler was the catalyst that made her realize she had to do something, and we were going to have to get out. We had to do something to get out of Austria. Well, my parents had separated. And when my sister was born, well, let me back up. My father was deaf, and he was born in Poland. He didn't exactly tell my mother the truth about where he was born. Now, if you look at the history of the areas that we're talking about, the Austrian people looked down their noses at the Polish people at this time. And I don't really understand the reason, to tell you the truth. Maybe it was a cultural difference or a behavioral difference between the two cultures. I don't really know what set this off, and it hasn't influenced me, I don't think, but it is a historical fact that there was not a good relationship between the Austrians and the Polish people at that time. And so my father was chasing my mother, and he lied to her. Now, my mother has her side of the story. She feels very strongly that he lied to her and that he changed his birth certificate to say he was born someplace else. This is my mother's story. And I don't know if she was just being paranoid. I never really did find the truth. I know for sure he was born in Poland. Well, anyway, they married. And it seems from the very beginning of their relationship and their marital life that the confidence was much diminished by finding out about this lie. When my sister was born, my father sort of tested her to see if she was deaf, and of course he found out by rattling pans and what have you that she was deaf. And he was depressed by this. It seemed to have really hit him hard. I asked my mother, why was he so upset about that? She said, well, that's him. He wanted hearing children. He wanted somebody to help him communicate, use the phone, which I think is kind of interesting. So then there was another child born in between that I told you about before. There was a little boy, hearing or deaf? It was a deaf boy. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how he died? Ooh, that's a sensitive topic. Why don't you hold it and later I'll get back to it. Anyway, then I was born. I guess I want to hurry up and talk about myself. Anyway, so I came along and I was found to be deaf, and that basically was the beginning of the dissolution of the marriage. They separated after that, and they never officially filed for divorce because when the Nazi occupation happened, one of the several edicts that were issued was that Jews could not apply for divorce. So they never were officially divorced. Now, my mother was coming to the realization that we were going to have to leave Austria, and she began going about the business of making plans. And people would say, 5 people leaving at once, that's quite an undertaking. So we did have an uncle who lived in America, and he was helping us with the paperwork, all the bureaucratic things, passports, money, and what have you. There was also a Jewish agency that was helping us out. So during that time, my mother realized that we had to make plans about where to go. First choice was America, definitely. But if things didn't work out, maybe we could emigrate to England. Many people were emigrating to England at the time, becoming cooks or maids, cleaning houses, being domestics. And the two of us, my sister and I, could go to school, of course. That was her intention. But first and foremost, she wanted America. If America and England didn't work out, then she thought we could apply for asylum in Israel. So we got all the paperwork and everything was all set. And I'm remembering this because my mother explained it to me. She said that we needed to get my father to sign a release so that we would be able to go and leave Austria. And I have to forgive my mother in retrospect, but she lied to my father and told him we were going to England. So my father said, are you going to go to America? And my mother said, no. We're not going to America. We're either going to go to England or Israel. So she lied to him. And why did she lie? Well, she knew that he would want to go to America too. If he knew that we were going, he'd want to come, and she didn't want him with us. So, I mean, that's the sad part, but what are you going to do? So I do remember that the time was approaching when we would be ready to leave, and it was time to get my father to sign these consent papers. And so we met him halfway on the street somewhere. I remember this clearly. And my father came up to us and he was signing. And I was shy. I was hanging on to my mother's skirts. I was hiding. But my sister was more bold, and she actually had a conversation with him. And my mother was cold and brusque and businesslike during the whole encounter. And that was the last time I saw him. So everything was prepared. All the papers were in order. And I always say that we were so blessed by God. Our family was so lucky. The time had come to leave, and my mother felt we needed to leave now. And my grandmother said, no, I need to say goodbye to family and friends and goodbye to everything that I'm going to leave behind. But my mother was intractable, and a large argument ensued between the two of them, and with the result that my mother won, of course. And we left in the dead of night very quietly in April 1940. We left. It was very quiet. The streets were desolate. We took a taxi. I remember everything was so quiet. And we took off. That's how we left the city. We took a train, and we had to go to the border of Austria and Italy. Now, people who are historians say that the train we took was the last train that we could take out of Austria before the war broke out. And we were very lucky to be able to do that. My grandmother was so angry that she hadn't been able to say goodbye to her husband's grave. She wanted to go to the grave and give a farewell, but there was no time, and my mother made her hasten out of the country. And I remember clearly on the train ride, we passed by the graveyard, and my grandmother was sitting at the window looking out and praying towards the spot where my grandfather was buried. I remember that very well. Well, then we got to Italy, and there we were in Italy waiting for our ship to arrive. We had to wait quite a while. My mother used to tell me that the boat we took was the last one that was available for us to take to America. And as soon as it arrived, we would embark upon it, and then that would be the last chance that anybody would have had. Everything in my life seems to be the last train, the last boat. Do you remember the name of the ship? Yes, it was the Rex. I remember the name. Kind of a strange name for a boat, but the Rex. It was an Italian liner, very beautiful. Of course, we were in third class down in steerage, but I remember looking around at it, and it was just a beautiful liner. Very pretty ship. And then we arrived. Well, it was very little at the time. And trains back then weren't what you call exactly sanitary. They did have a toilet in one of the cars, but what it was just a hole in the floor of the car that you had to squat over, and then everything would just go down and land on the tracks beneath you. So I saw it, but I hadn't known anything about it before, and I refused to go. Well, my uncle, who really was like a father to me, tried to force me to go into the bathroom because he saw that I was very uncomfortable. He could tell that I was holding it and I was squirming, and I obviously needed to use the facilities, but I just wouldn't. He started to spank me, and I cried and cried, but he forced me to go. And maybe that was wrong. I could have gone by myself, but he didn't want me to get sick. He felt for health reasons, for health's sake, that I should definitely make the effort. So finally I did go, and I held on to him for dear life because I was so afraid I was going to fall through that hole and then land on the tracks below. I remember it very well. It's kind of a funny story. That's what happened. When we got to the Italian border, and we were still on the Austrian side, the Gestapo was there waiting for us. And they would come in and perform inspections. And they would also confiscate everybody's money or their valuables because they didn't want anybody to go on and have any money or have any kind of possibility of a comfortable life in their future. We did have a few valuables, some gold earrings, rings, chains, and we sewed them into the shoulder pads of our clothes. I did tell that story before to you, I think. We didn't have a lot, but that's what we did with what we had. We were able to bring actually many of our belongings with us. We had 3 wooden crates full of our effects. Some furnishings, some clothes. We actually brought a mattress. I know that seems odd, but we brought a mattress. And trinkets, just different things that we were allowed to bring with us. Now later, everything shut down and you weren't allowed to bring anything with you. Oh, and also we did have the photographs that you've seen. Those were things we were able to bring with us to America. So we had these 3 crates of our belongings. And I had my doll in one of those boxes too. I remember very clearly I had my doll in there. So we stopped at the border. And one of the things I remember is that we waited and waited and waited at the border, and the train just wouldn't go. Finally, we moved on. And as we moved on, we saw that a lot of people who had actually disembarked from the train had come back, and some of them were going up to my grandmother saying, "Oh, you're so lucky, you weren't taken out, you're very lucky." And my mother talked to her and said, what are they talking about? And we found out that when the Gestapo looked at the different passengers, if there was anything about you that looked the least bit suspicious, they would take you off the train and strip search you and confiscate whatever you had on your person. This didn't happen to us. Now, my sister disagreed with me and always said that that did happen to us, but I remember just sitting on the train and waiting forever. And this is my recollection. It differs from hers. So I always say that God protected us and protected our family from harm on this journey because we were able to get to where we could get on the boat, and then we took off. And in the middle of the ocean, I became seasick, of course. We also celebrated Passover in the middle of our voyage, and we had a Seder on board the boat. Now, finally, we got to America, and I remember I was so excited that we were there. The sign for America was produced by a hand patting the cheek. And the reason my mother used to use this sign is because she grew up during World War I, and the U.S. soldiers would pat the children on the cheek. Some people say that that sign is actually because American women wore so much makeup and rouge, that's where that sign emanated from, but I think either one is actually accurate. But that was the sign that we used. Now, I think things are a little different now. There's a difference in the signing now compared to back then in Austria, but that's the one we used. So there we were, and my mother pointed out the Statue of Liberty. I sat at the railing looking up, and we were nervous but excited at the same time. I remember this very well. Finally, we docked. And we looked down at the throngs of people waiting on the pier. I remember wondering, where's my uncle? Is he among all these folks down on the pier waiting for us? People started to leave the boat, but we were left behind. There was so much paperwork and red tape that we had to get through. So we started to become concerned as to why we weren't allowed off the boat. My grandmother was given permission to leave. She was hearing, and there was no problem with her, but since we were deaf, we had to stay. But of course, my grandmother decided to stay with us. She had no intention of abandoning us, so she decided that she needed to protect us and she would stay behind. So there we were on the boat, and we had to stay overnight. And I was so disappointed. There we were in New York. We couldn't get off this boat. My mother kept saying, I don't know why. I don't know why. We just have to wait. I'm not sure why. The next day, we were driven all over town so that we could catch the ferry. Now, where we docked was a pier. I'm not exactly sure where it is. I haven't been able to find it. It's somewhere on the east side, the Italian area, I think. But then we had to go catch this ferry that would take us to Ellis Island. And there we stayed on Ellis Island for 5 months. Now, the reason we had to be there so long was because war had broken out. And the U.S. wasn't sure if they wanted to take in 4 deaf people to become welfare cases. The money was going to the war effort. So they weren't sure they wanted to accept us. There were 4 of us who were deaf, and it just seemed like that was just a little too much for them to take in all at once. So there was a lot of going back and forth and trying to find people who'd be able to help us convince the authorities to let us in. There was one woman who was a social worker. Her name was Mrs. Ash. She worked for the New York Society of the Deaf. Not the Rochester Society, it was New York City. And so she was a great woman. She was deaf, and she would communicate with us. She'd come over to Ellis Island quite frequently, and she was advocating for us. She was trying to convince them we could work. My uncle's a tailor. There's no problem with him being able to find gainful employment. My mother as well. Both of them would be able to work. And my sister and I would go to school, of course. We were so fortunate that we were able to get a guardian, somebody who decided to sort of sponsor us, you might say, and look after us. He became our guardian. He happened to have a deaf daughter. And his grandson, is this Osserman? Yes, his grandson was friends with us. That's right, it's Osserman. His name is Simon E. Osserman. Simon E. Osserman. Oh, yes, it was Beatrice. Now, Jimmy, now, was that the mother? Yes, that's Jimmy's mother, and this was his grandfather, was Simon. Beatrice is the mother. Jimmy's grandfather is Simon. So Beatrice is the mother's name? Yes, Beatrice is the deaf daughter of Simon, who was our guardian. Osserman's the last name. Now, I didn't know anything about this connection until much, much later when I found out, and I was so surprised. I mean, small world. So there we were for 5 months, and bonds had to be posted for us. We had to protect the bonds. The grandfather, Simon, became our guardian, and he was able to communicate with us. He had a deaf daughter, and he vouched for us. So he had to take care of loans. We had to get some money out in the form of bonds that he had to vouch for. We had to protect. He had to say that the children were deaf would be in school. My grandmother wasn't a problem at all because she was older and she wasn't going to be a liability to anybody. But anyway, it took 5 months for us to go through all of this. And if we hadn't done this, anywhere along this process, at any time, if the U.S. had decided not to accept us, we could have just been sent back. We would have been deported. I've heard a lot of stories about people who got this far in the process and then were kicked out. They were deported back to Europe. So our ship, the Rex, had stayed and then finally left to go back to Europe, and we could have easily been back on that if we hadn't been accepted into the U.S. Now, the Army, one particular faction of it, there was the SS, there was the Army, and there was the Gestapo. There were 3 different factions. The SS wore black uniforms. I don't even remember what SS stood for. It's some long spelling. But anyway, they had these really amazing uniforms, black hats and black shirts, black boots, very mysterious. I remember that clearly. And they would show up unannounced anytime they wanted and just go through these inspection processes in people's houses. And it always happened in the dead of night, never during the day, always in the middle of the night. They would just let themselves in and demand to have access to your house. Now, my area was in the process of becoming a ghetto, which means that all the Jewish people were being condensed into one particular area. Our area was called District 2. I believe it was District 2. Yeah, District 2. That was the area that was becoming a ghetto. Now, we lived in a fairly small place. I don't remember it, but I've seen pictures of the apartment, and if you looked at it, you realize it was a very small place to live. And I really had no idea at the time because I was small, but it wasn't a really big building, and it's still there, actually. It's still standing. But it didn't matter to the Nazis at all how much room you had. They moved the 5 of us into one of the rooms in our apartment. I remember we had all our beds in one room, and we were so squeezed and crammed together. They had our beds, our sofa, our chairs, everything in one room. There was a kitchen down the hall, but all of our living arrangements had to be crammed into this one small room, which would then leave our other room available for another family to occupy, somebody we didn't even know. I don't even remember the name of the family, to tell you the truth. Can't remember their last name. I just don't know. But I do remember that the area was becoming a ghetto, and they moved into our building. And I think they were from another country. I just can't remember where. But we had all been born in Austria, which was very fortunate, and I think that saved us in the long run. So one night my grandmother heard this pounding, and the lights were flashing, and she looked out the window, and all the lights were flashing everywhere. Very, very noisy. And somebody was pounding on all the buildings and all the doors of our building. And she looked through the window and was just terrified because she saw that these raids were happening that night. And finally realized that they were going to definitely be making one of these nocturnal visits to our home. The door was pounded, and she opened it. And there were no questions that you could ask. They would just move you right out of the side and begin their inspection of your house willy-nilly. And I remember I took it all in stride because I didn't think anything of it. I didn't understand it. But my sister was a little girl who had sort of treasures and secrets. She had like a little compartment where she kept her junk, you know, her little trinkets and things that a little girl might have, her private effects. So she was guarding her treasures, and she tried to hide them. I don't know why she did that. It just drew attention to it. But then the SS guy moved her out of the way and opened it and just found it was junk. It was no big deal. And my mother, her heart had been racing and her knees had been knocking, and she was so scared. So they rifled through everything in the house, and then an interesting thing happened. One of the SS officers' eyes met my uncle's across the room. And then he suddenly said, "Let me see your passports or visa." And actually, the other family, it ended up had been born in Poland, and they were taken out at that very moment, and I think they were sent to a concentration camp. But he looked at my uncle's papers. We've been born in Austria, thank God, because that's what saved us. And his eyes met my uncle's across the room, and there seemed to be some sort of important communication happening between the two of them, because then he said, "That's all right, there's nothing here, let's go. We can leave now." So they took off, just from that communication that happened across the room between them. So as soon as they left, my mother asked my uncle, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, we know each other. We used to work as tailors together. And now he's joined the Nazis. He's moved up in the world. I don't know. But it's strange when his whole affect changed as soon as he saw my uncle, and he realized that he knew him. He knew he was deaf, and he knew he'd worked with him before. He'd been mean, and then all of a sudden, he totally changed his affect. And then he took his cronies out the door, and they left. And that really saved us." Well, it's kind of a sticky situation to talk about. Remember, my parents were separated. And we'd come to America. Time passed. and I think it was around 1945 or so. The war was over, and we had a good friend. Remember I was talking earlier about Fred Freud, a friend of ours? His daughter wrote a book about the parents. Anyway, so they were from Vienna, Austria also. So they had deaf parents too. So our families and their families used to always gather together. In fact, some of the pictures, you can actually see our families co-joined at these gatherings, picnics or whatever. Anyway, Fred had deaf parents, and he told us about what happened after the occupation, 40, 41, 42, what have you, that he was sent to a concentration camp. And he mentions, now he didn't tell us very much, of course. Oh, by the way, let me add, he was liberated. He survived the camps, as I said. And he came and looked us up, and he said that, well, he was a little evasive at first. He said, what do you want to know? And we started mentioning different names of people that we knew to see if he knew what had befallen them. And he told my mother, your husband was in one of the deaf groups in one of the concentration camps. And that news took my mother aback. She just couldn't say much to that statement. She was shocked about that. And he said now he was lucky because he and his parents had been in a group of people who didn't sign and draw attention to themselves. And in the separation process, they were sent to a labor camp because nobody knew they were deaf. That in that separation line where they called people, my father was taken out and sent to a gas chamber. And he was definitely sent to the gas chamber because he was in a group of deaf people who were signing and gesturing. And obviously the Nazis had no interest in maintaining deaf people or handicapped people of any way, shape, or form. And during that separation process, he was sent to the gas chamber. And he said it was a definite fact that he was one of them in that group and that he was gone. And he said there was no doubt about it. Now, it breaks my heart when I think about it. And I still want to know, have you seen any proof, like a name on a list or anything? Well, my mother said, fine, if you want to try to find him, that's fine. And if you do find him, he can stay with you. He's not going to stay with me. And I was just aghast. I mean, as if there'd be a choice if I found him, you know? But anyway, that's her and how she felt about things. But I did want to know very much. I'm very curious. When I became a U.S. citizen years later, I had to have proof of my parentage. And of course, I needed to find out about my father. And I need to find out some kind of proof or some sort of card or something that would have something about him. And the Red Cross gave me information that said he was last seen in Minsk. Now, I don't know what concentration camp was actually near Minsk, but evidently he was taken to Russia or something. I don't know, but he was last seen in Minsk. Now, Minsk is in a disputed territory between Poland and Russia. It seems to go back and forth as to who owns it. So they checked the records, and they did not find my father's name, but they did find my grandmother's father's name on the list, which was a thrill to find out what happened to them, but we never did actually find out about my father's name. My father's name was Isidore Rattner. Well, they didn't ask us, and we didn't say anything about it. It was hidden right in the shoulder pads. We sewed it right into the pads. That's where it was. Let's see, do I have anything on me from that time? We had some bracelets. And I did have a long gold chain that at one point we cut up and we made into several different bracelets. Of course, I lost mine. I'm so stupid. I lost mine. But some of my children have remnants of that chain. While I was in the train, I didn't see what it looked like. We had to stop on the Austrian side to get over to Italy, and we had to go through this checkpoint, and I didn't see what it looked like. It was dark. It was at nighttime. But we were on the Austrian side when all this happened. Nope, never. We were very fortunate. We were very, very fortunate. And I remember seeing my mother telling me that she saw people being tortured in the streets in Vienna old Jews with long beards sometimes had them pulled by people. They were mocked. People were spat on. People had to wash the streets and what have you. But you didn't see anything through the window yourself. Your mother kept you away. Yes, I was protected. I was very well protected from seeing any of that. But I do remember one thing very clearly. It was the time of, oh gosh, I can never spell this, Kristallnacht. The night that they destroyed everything. They destroyed the temples too, as you know, and we had a temple right next door to us. And it was burned to the ground. I remember this very clearly. I was able to look out the window and crane my neck and see it burned. And did they do this every year on the anniversary? Well, I think it's important to preserve our history. And it's important for people to know that it really did happen. Some people make comments that anger me incredibly. I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. A lot of people go, have you been? Have you been to the Holocaust Museum in D.C.? Have you? Well, you go all the way at the top and you work your way to the bottom. And afterwards, sometimes people make the comments that, oh, I don't believe this is true. I don't believe this really happened. You know, people do say that. It's a very ugly thing for people to think, and it infuriates me. Now, as I grew up, I never even realized what happened and what the Nazis did to so many people. I didn't realize that until much later. I look back and I realize that it's an incredible history that we have to preserve. I wish I could tell my mother I'm sorry. So many times I look to the heavens and say, Mama, I'm so sorry. Because people would often ask her, how did you come here? Why are you in America? And she would go on these long harangues and tell the whole story over and over. I'd say, Mom, will you stop it already? It's boring. You're boring everybody to tears. And my mother would say, they're asking me. They want to know. I have to tell them. And now I'm not much better. People ask me, and here I am going on and on about it too. Well, it's a story that lives on through the generations, and it'll keep going through you. It makes me smile. That's it. I just hope this history will never repeat.